And then I just want to talk more about like how to scale and be more efficient with your Terraform configurations. As your team grows and as you deploy more infrastructure, more applications, et cetera, you're going to grow your configuration files pretty large. So when you're doing that, a common pitfall is to just put everything in one big configuration file and then just deploy that with Terraform. But Terraform does a process called a refresh. So if I were to actually go back to the Kubernetes side, yeah, let's go in there. Go to app. So when I go use Terraform, if I do a plan, Terraform does this like refresh operation right here where it says reading, right? Or a refreshing state. When you have thousands of resources in a configuration, you're going to do a refresh for each one of those resources. Each one of those refreshes does an API call to the upstream API. You can run into API rate limiting very quickly, right? Or you can slow your stuff down. Maybe that API round trip takes a little long. So as you want to scale your use of Terraform, it's best to break them up across logical boundaries that make sense, right? And these logical boundaries are for you to decide. Do you break it up per app? Do you break it up per environment? Do you break it up per environment per app, right? Do you break it up per team? That's up to you. But breaking up your Terraform configurations into smaller, more manageable pieces is super beneficial from a performance standpoint. And I truly believe that the best logical boundary that you can have is the boundary that I'm showing today, which is the boundary between base infrastructure and product infrastructure, right? App infrastructure. Why? Base infrastructure doesn't change that often, right? It's a very infrequently changing thing. So you're not going to waste Terraform refreshes because it's not changing. So you leave that in another state file, and then your app stuff stays in another state file because that's kind of changing more frequently. So that's a good logical boundary to, if you don't have any logical boundaries that you can find, one of the ones that I recommend people is make a boundary between what changes infrequently and what changes frequently. And that's kind of like your first place that you can split things on. From that, outside of refreshing and whatnot, there's also a parallelism argument that you can use with Terraform. So if I do Terraform help or Terraform plan help, you can see that there's this parallelism argument. This, by default, Terraform runs, in parallel, and it tries to do at most 10 operations in parallel. So if you have 100 resources, it'll try to refresh them 10 at a time, right? Like in a window of 10 at a time. You can increase this number if you want. You can make this do 50. You can make this do 100, but that'll increase your memory usage. But if you want to deal with performance and scaling, and you just have a large configuration that you really can't split up anymore, you can play with some knobs here, right? So when you're trying to be more efficient and scale up your configuration, you have options, is what I'm trying to say. We've took existing infrastructure, we've pulled it into Terraform, we deployed it to do app using a VM-based approach, and we saw like the pros and cons of doing that. And then we moved to more greenfield application where we deployed a Kubernetes cluster, the platform, and we deployed the to-do app on top of Kubernetes, right? So you saw kind of two approaches, the existing infrastructure and like a more greenfield approach. And we weighed the pros and cons between them and talked about that a little bit. So that's kind of the recap of what we did today. And obviously we covered what Terraform is, how it works, and why you would want to use it. So if you take these, you can probably find a spot in your organization where you're like, oh, I have this like great place to use Terraform. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, but I'll mention now, Terraform is really, really good at managing that boring stuff that you have, right? Like we all have GitHub repositories. Well, GitHub repositories have all of these settings that you can change and manage, right? Terraform can manage this stuff for you. Branch protection rules, little checkboxes on and off. Terraform can manage the sport for you. This is that boring stuff. Team membership, right? PagerDuty schedules, like all of that boring stuff that you never really want to touch. Terraform's a great candidate for that stuff. So if you have that boring infrastructure, that's like a fantastic first place to get Terraform involved. Then from there, you can build up your confidence over time and then move Terraform closer to your production infrastructure. So I want to just talk about that because a lot of people are like, when they think of Terraform, they think of, I have to deploy my production apps. You can just manage your DNS records. Go manage your MX records for your company domain, right? Like you can just manage your DNS records at first. You can start small and build up over time.
For the full course, visit courses.ardenlabs.com.